Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Clay Zimmerman, one of your hosts of the Real Science Exchange, and this afternoon we're coming from the New Developments in Transition Cow Nutrition seminar here in Nantes, France. I'm not the normal host of the Real Science Exchange. Scott Sorrell was not able to make it to Europe with us this week, but I'm filling in for Scott. I've been told that I have a face made for radio, but not a voice made for radio. I'd like to introduce our speakers from this afternoon's, from today's session. Our first guest is Dr. Francis Enjalbert. His topic was metabolic stress in peripartum dairy cows. Dr. Enjalbert is recently retired from the Toulouse National Veterinary School. Our second guest is Dr. José Santos from the University of Florida. His topic for today was choline, a required nutrient for dairy cows. Our third guest is Dr. Philippe Verdoolaege, and his topic was strategic monitoring of transition cows with high milk production. So, what's in your glass tonight, José?
Blend of Merlot with Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and something else. Yeah, it's actually a very decent red wine.
So I think we're all drinking the same thing tonight, taking in the local culture here in France. So I'll start with you, Dr. Enjalbert. Can you give us a brief summary of what you discussed today?
In French or in English?
Whatever you prefer.
French, of course.
Okay.
Bien oui, on a parlé ce matin de stress métabolique chez la vache laitière en péripartum, qui doit en fait faire face à un ensemble de défis avec une intrication entre des défis nutritionnels liés à l'évolution très rapide des besoins alimentaires et une évolution plus lente de l'ingestion, des changements de ration, mais aussi des défis qui ont pour origine des processus inflammatoires et immunitaires, je dirais, fortement sollicités pendant cette période, et cet ensemble de défis crée une situation à risque élevé, et une gestion imparfaite de ces risques peut conduire à des maladies nutritionnelles ou à des conséquences parfois moins visibles mais économiquement importantes, qui sont des conséquences sur la production laitière, sur la reproduction ou une diminution des défenses immunitaires.
Thank you. Dr. Santos, can you give us a summary of your talk from today?
Yeah, well, so in my presentation I tried to give a brief history of choline as a nutrient for dairy cattle. And if I were to briefly summarize that, I would say that it fits the criteria of a nutrient that should be provided in the diet of dairy cattle, in particular during the transition period, for numerous reasons that were covered during the presentation.
Dr. Verdoolaege, can you give us a brief summary?
Oui, donc moi j'ai abordé un petit peu les aspects pratiques, je dirais, d'encadrement du management de cette période de transition, en reprenant un petit peu quatre sujets stratégiques que sont la gestion de l'hypocalcémie et la prévention de cette hypocalcémie, tout ce qui tourne autour du statut énergétique, reprendre un petit peu des éléments concernant le challenge inflammatoire, immunitaire et puis tous les aspects stress autour de cette période de transition et enfin rapidement les enjeux au niveau de la qualité du lait.
And then my presentation was not all ruminant encapsulates are created equal. So the brief summary of that, I discussed some of the basic differences that there can be in ruminant encapsulates, and really what are the four characteristics of a good ruminant encapsulate. The first one being ruminal stability. The second one being intestinal availability or bioavailability. The third one being feed and TMR stability. And then the fourth one being ultimately showing a biological response to that product in the cow. So we'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience at this point. So let's start with our first question.
Bonjour, Laurent Thiocourt. Donc j'aurais une question plutôt pour nos interlocuteurs académiques. On a évoqué une certaine communauté d'action entre la choline et la méthionine en tant que donneur de méthyle. C'est le premier point. Le deuxième, c'est qu'on a vu les recommandations en méthionine pendant cette phase de préparation au vélage augmenter énormément, avec des chiffres jusqu'à hauteur de 35 grammes par jour proposés par les gens de l'Illinois. Qu'en est-il de l'intérêt de la choline pour des doses de méthionine aussi élevées?
I'm not sure if your question is... I think I'll be as transparent as I can be. I think we really don't know what the specific amino acid needs are for prepartum cows. I think our knowledge is very shallow in that area. We know a lot more of the amino acid needs during lactation because of the extraction by the mammary gland and the dose response experiments that we've had. I'm assuming that your question is related because of the interplay between methionine and choline, and if I feed a very high diet in methionine before calving, how do I place choline there? So my personal opinion, and you can take it with a grain of salt, as we say, is that I think we understand well the amino acid, particularly methionine, a little less lysine, and a lot less other amino acids during lactation. And we should be formulating diets for amino acid balance during lactation. But I'm not sure if we have to supplement rumen protect amino acids prepartum at this state. Yeah. So I'll tell you that because we can easily meet the metabolizable protein needs of the cow by using diets without rumen protected amino acids. It doesn't mean that they don't need, but I don't think at this stage we really know that. And the reason why I say this is because most of our literature hasn't sorted out the effects of before from the effects of after calving. All the experiments with amino acids, with a few exceptions during transition, have been before and after. Never let's look at before, after, or the combination. There are a few experiments that supplemented only before, only after, in both. And they do not support supplementation before. And there are experiments in which the total metabolized protein have been manipulated before calving. And if a cow is a multi-pairs, you don't always have response, and in many cases you have a negative effect of adding too much metabolized protein. And whenever you have negative effects, you should suspect that we just don't know enough. There is no set number that we should recommend because we don't know enough. Now, the same weakness exists in the choline literature. Most of our experiments with choline are before and after. That's the same story, yeah? So in the choline experiments that I've showed you today and many others that people have done, we supplemented rumen protected methionine in particular because of this interplay between methionine and choline. So we try to eliminate a potential methionine deficiency to avoid that, hey, maybe the effect of choline was because we underfed methionine. That was not the case, I think, in the bulk of the most recent literature, in the experiments at the University of Florida, Michigan State University, and University of Wisconsin. All of those cows received supplemental room protect methionine. In our case, they received 250 to 300 grams of a high quality blood meal that provides a lot of histidine and lysine. So we try to address that to isolate the effect of choline. So if you were to ask me, should I make recommendations of choline based on how much methionine I feed, I would say very honestly that we don't know that at this point. But I would say with a certain degree of certainty that with the typical diets, even when you supplement methionine, you should supplement choline during the transition period. Now going back to the protected amino acids in general, I think there's a major role for protected amino acids in lactation diets. I think we just don't know what's their role today on prepartum diets.
Would either of the other speakers like to comment?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Next question.
Yes, thank you. I am Valérie Moisan from Technovet Export. My question is for Mr. Zimmerman. You spoke about frozen product. You did it very well. And why did you spoke about that? Is it for bakery product or is it for ruminant product that you find some frozen one, and where? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the examples that I was talking about were in ruminant end caps. So we do a lot of testing of certainly of our products and also competitive products. We do occasionally find competitive products that are not freeze-thaw stable. And I showed some pictures of those where you can see cracks in the coating. So certainly, depending on the climate in a country or where that product may be coming from, there are climates where these encapsulates can be frozen either during transport or on farm. And so if a product's not freeze-thaw stable, you just need to be aware of that you're going to lose product efficacy if they happen to go through that type of environmental conditions. Next question.
Thanks very much. Nicolas Omnes de CCPA. One question about, we spoke a lot about the requirement and about the choline. And do you think that Cornell or NASEM or those systems will soon include choline in their requirements? J'étends la question dans le monde francophone. Est-ce que on peut penser à, alors je sais pas comment va s'appeler la nouvelle version de Cristal dans l'avenir, mais est-ce qu'on peut penser avoir des recommandations ou des demandes de choline dans le système français?
On peut y penser. La réponse positive, on peut y penser, mais je ne suis pas sûr qu'on l'ait fait. Voilà, donc je pense que ça n'est pas pour demain, en tout cas. Alors, au niveau des recommandations américaines, je laisse la parole à José Santos, mais au niveau INRA, alors je n'ai jamais fait partie des groupes de travail qui ont établi les recommandations INRA, mais je pense que les données sont actuellement considérées comme insuffisantes, comme ça a été fait dans les recommandations NASEM récemment aux États-Unis, pour arriver à des recommandations chiffrées. Voilà. Et je n'ai pas entendu parler de réflexion sur des recommandations chiffrées au niveau de l'INRA. Voilà.
Yeah, well, obviously in the most recent publication in the US, which is the 2021 NASEM, we don't have set guidelines for choline. we do, in the book you read that there is, in the transition cow chapter, they address choline as a nutrient, and in the model it estimates the intake of choline from the feeds, from the feed library, but there is no red flag because you didn't feed enough or you are below the required absorbable amount. In general, I would say all of those models, I can speak for the nascent, they are based on the best information available, okay? And academics, we are typically conservative in general. We want to have solid data to make a recommendation. Sometimes we are not that conservative. There are some nutrients that there's very weak data available to set guidelines, and nevertheless we still set guidelines. A good example is vitamin D. Okay, so if you read critically the literature and the NRC recommends a set amount, 30,000 international units based on the average body weight of the cow, you'll be hard pressed to find where's that value coming from. So it's the best guideline there is, but choline is a new, between quotation, nutrient, so it's going to take a little time for that to be listed. And I think part of it is what I showed you before. It's because it has to be rumen protected. Perhaps, the company that Clay works for, Balchem, their product differs from other products. Then it creates uncertainty in the delivery of choline to the small intestine. And that creates an issue of what is the actual recommendation, because most of our literature is based on empirical data. And what I mean by empirical is that we feed and we measure responses. So we don't know the exact amount absorbed there. And until we change this paradigm, or we accept that we're going to live off the empirical values, it's going to take some time until specific guidelines will appear in the literature, I would say.
So one thing I would like to add to that, not related to a requirement or so forth, but we've done a lot of work the last few years in our monogastric business looking at the choline levels that are in common feedstuffs for poultry and swine. Corn, soybean meal, and some other ingredients that are commonly fed to monogastrics. And what's been happening over time is the choline levels in those ingredients, they're much less than what are in the databases that are out there. So that can certainly affect choline feeding rates in monogastrics. There's not as much in these ingredients as you commonly find in the databases that are out there. That's not really going to impact a ruminant because it's so highly degraded, but it's sort of an interesting fact. Next question.
Laurent Joko again. The French and European milk payment system are based on volume, but also on true protein and fat content. Does choline supplementation have an impact on these contents, milk solid contents?
Or milk solids contents. So it depends on how.
You mentioned the milk volume increase, but what about the true protein and fat content?
Yeah, but remember the milk volume that I mentioned isn't adjusted for components, meaning that fat and protein yield goes up. The concentration not necessarily. Okay? So you will find experiments that fat content goes up, but it's not as consistent as the fat yield. In the United States, we really care about the yield of fat and protein more so than we care about the concentration, because we are paid for kilograms of fat, kilograms of protein, and kilograms of milk, defatted milk, depending upon what market you are. So we emphasize a lot more how many kilos or pounds of fat protein you produce per day than if your milk has 4 or 4.5 or 5% fat. So if me as a producer, I prefer to produce 1.5 kilograms of fat per day with X kilograms of milk than to produce 1.3 kilograms of fat per day with 6% fat in the milk.
That's the reason why I mentioned Europe and France, because milk payment is based on content, percentage, fat percent, true protein percent, that impact the milk volume price. And then you multiply by the volume.
Okay, well, I don't understand exactly how your payment price is. So in the United States, we have certain stimulus for above a particular threshold, but once you're above that, everything is based on the mass of product that you provide. Yeah, but yeah, well, it's difference in policies. At the end of the day, I'm buying a product. I want to buy more kilograms of a product.
Yeah, so basically what we see when we supplement choline, increase milk yield without we're not diluting the milk protein or milk fat percentages. Yeah, so that gives you a higher yield of both then.
Oui, j'ajouterais que si on prend les résultats expérimentaux qui sont publiés, on a toujours les deux données, c'est-à-dire la quantité de lait, les taux et la quantité totale de protéines et de matières grasses. Donc avec ça, on peut s'en sortir avec les différents systèmes de paiement.
Next question.
Bonjour. 3 questions. Une première qui serait sur les résultats donc, annoncés de la colline. J'ai pas eu les croisements, j'ai peut-être pas suffisamment fait attention, mais j'ai pas eu les croisements des niveaux de calcium, niveau BACA, les UF, la matière azotée sur ces essais-là. Ça, c'est première question. La deuxième qui est un petit peu la suite, c'est quelle est pour vous votre priorité, je dirais, aujourd'hui dans les recommandations déjà Balchem, UF, protéines, calcium, phosphore, BACA et pourquoi pas lysine, méthionine si aujourd'hui il y en avait, voire dosage de choline. Mais j'ai cru comprendre qu'en effet il n'y avait pas forcément de préconisation aujourd'hui à ça. Et 2 dernières questions qui étaient plus sur des aspects cahier des charges, qui étaient l'aspect non OGM sur la lysine. Si j'ai bien compris, aujourd'hui elle est protégée, mais d'une manière, en partant d'une huile OGM. Nous, en France, on a beaucoup de cahiers des charges où l'aspect OGM est décrié. Donc ça, c'est un frein pour le développement de ce type de produit. Et idem pour la choline, qui, elle, est sur une huile de palme. Et la France est aussi un peu contre les huiles de palme. Alors je ne sais pas s'il y a d'autres solutions, ou si d'un point de vue étiquetage et réglementation, on a le droit de formuler différemment pour pouvoir utiliser. Mais aujourd'hui, c'est 2 contraintes, je dirais, sur vos produits qui limitent leur développement fortement, je dirais, dans nos régions à cahier des charges.
Okay. A number of questions there to address. So the recommendation, so Reassure XC is the product that we sell in Europe. It's produced at our encapsulation facility in Italy, and it is a non-GMO product that's made there. As far as recommendations, so our standard recommendation and what we've used in the research trials that we've been showing, it's 30 grams per cow per day, and we recommend it 21 days prepartum to 21 days postpartum. Obviously, there are people feeding it shorter periods of time or longer periods of time than that, but I would say probably for the last 15 to 20 years, most of our research trials, we've really focused on feeding it during the transition period, 21 days pre to 21 days postpartum. As far as recommendations, for other nutrients, we, as you heard from the other speakers this morning, as related to negative decans, and actually what I would say is a lot of the a lot of the DCAD slides that you saw this morning were actually from Dr. Santos's lab and the meta-analysis that was shown. So I'll probably let him address that a little bit because I think he may want to speak to that a little bit. As far as amino acid recommendations, I don't really know the recommendations for the INRA model, just to be honest. Certainly, as Dr. Santos mentioned earlier in addressing one of the questions, these fresh cows, very early lactation cows, are very responsive to amino acid supplementation. So the numbers that I'm used to, or recommendations, are based, that I'm more used to, are based on the Cornell model, the CNCPS model. And I think the best way to look at amino acid feeding recommendations is grams of metabolizable amino acid per megacal of metabolizable energy. So if I was feeding a fresh cow, from a lysine standpoint, we're typically targeting anywhere between 3.0 and 3.2 grams of metabolizable lysine per megacal of ME. From a methionine standpoint, we're typically targeting somewhere between 1.10 and 1.19 grams per megacal of ME.
I second your answer. So, I think the responses to choline, other than what I showed you, they are not really dependent on a lot of other things. So, definitely not dependent on calcium in the diet, if I understood your comment. But maybe you were talking about prevention of hypocalcemia. Is that what it was? So obviously, if the limitation on the farm is hypocalcemia, the benefits to all the other strategies will be somewhat limited because you have another struggling aspect there. So the most common strategy in the United States today to prevent hypocalcemia is what was discussed today, is the balancing of minerals in the prepartum diet by formulating what we call acidogenic diets that cause metabolic acidosis. But there are other strategies. The two most common today are either balancing what we call the dietary cation anion difference, okay, or using zeolites to sequester phosphorus, not necessarily calcium. So those are the most common strategies. By far, DCAD is the most common strategy. In the best farms, it's only used in multiparous cows. So they separate primiparous cows that will eventually be primiparous. They don't receive acidogenic diets. We only control the potassium in the diet. Our farms are large. Most good producers select ingredients that are low in potassium for the prepartum cows. So the typical prepartum diet will have a large component that's corn silage that typically is low in potassium. And then there will be some hay or haylage that is selected based on potassium content. So the whole idea is to limit potassium intake and to limit phosphorus intake. Those two concepts, that's the baseline of preventing hypocalcemia. So on top of that, depending upon what strategy you use, you may use acidogenic salts. In the US, there are designed products that are formulated for that. You can buy from different companies, or you can use salts such as magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, ammonium chloride. The most important thing is to not induce severe acidosis. There are companies that will tell you to have very low DCAD, very low urine pH. That is damaging to the cow. It's great for the company who sells the product. It's bad for your producer's cows. Metabolic acidosis is only used to control mineral balance. There's, to the best of our knowledge today, there's no other major positive effect, and there are many negative effects. So when you do that, you increase the whole calcium flux in the body. And probably the most important mechanism is that the cow excrete calcium in the urine. That is somewhat not discussed very much in the physiology of acidogenic diets. But when you go from a traditional diet that has no very high chloride or even sulfur, a prepartum cow only loses 200 to 500 milligrams of calcium in the urine a day. When you feed an acidogenic diet that causes compensated metabolic acidosis, this cow now excretes in the urine about 10 to as many as 15 grams. And that is a major plus to the cow. Because once she does that, now she has to upregulate all the mechanisms to bring calcium back into the bloodstream. So she upregulates calcium absorption. Because you cause acidosis, there is an immediate response from bone buffering that releases calcium, and there's a delayed response, which is to bring calcium back through macrophage action in the bones. So then blood calcium goes up. So the whole calcium flux increases. You do not need to feed more calcium in the diet because of that. It's another wrong concept that's presented to people in the field, like you have to feed 120, 150, 200 grams of calcium. Every time you feed acidogenic diets, intestinal calcium absorption goes up 10 to 15 percentage points. So of that same diet that you feed, she absorbs more. So if you feed a diet with moderate calcium concentration, 0.6, 0.7%, she's always in positive calcium balance. We've measured that 4 or 5 experiments. We always show the same thing. So yes, that's one strategy. There's a second school, which is I don't deal with the acidogenic diets because that needs to be managed. You need to measure urine pH. You need to analyze feeds. You cannot use NIRS. It has to be based on either atomic absorption or ICP analysis of minerals. There's people who are not willing to manage that. So what they do is they use zeolites. And to the best of our knowledge today, zeolites bind many things, as it was shown, but it binds primarily, at least the newest products, the aluminum silicates bind to phosphorus. And that prevents phosphorus absorption. And that causes a slight hypophosphatemia before calving. When blood phosphorus is low, okay, the bone doesn't secrete a hormone that's called fibroblast growth factor 23. Is so-called FGF23. So this FGF23 is a hormone that regulates blood phosphate. Okay? So if you have high blood phosphorus, the bone secretes FGF23. If you have low blood phosphorus, the bone secretes less FGF23. What FGF23 does is to increase renal excretion of phosphate and to suppress phosphate absorption in the gastrointestinal tract. And the way it does that, one of the mechanisms, is by suppressing an enzyme that's expressed in the kidney that activates the final step of vitamin D. So it's an hydroxylase that has a hydroxyl group in the one position of the vitamin D molecule. So when you have high FGF23, you suppress the synthesis of the active vitamin D3. And that reduces phosphate absorption, but it also reduces calcium absorption. So when you feed high phosphorus to cows prepartum, you predispose them to hypocalcemia through this pathway. So when you feed zeolites and low phosphorus, you reduce the chance of having low active form of vitamin D3. Then calcium metabolism is enhanced. So there's 2 options for prevention through the diet. And then you can obviously give calcium to cows, do other things after calving. But those are the 2. So in the US, I would say most farms use one of the 2 strategies. That is always part of the prepartum program. It's unquestionable. So nobody would feed amino acids without preventing hypocalcemia. Nobody would feed choline without preventing hypocalcemia. You walk to any farm, the same way they vaccinate every cow, everybody prevents hypocalcemia. That's just part of feeding the cow. It's another technology that's in any farm that's going to survive the next 5 years. 100% of them will do some strategy to prevent that.
Oui, je suis parfaitement d'accord avec tout ce qui a été dit. Effectivement, la question des risques liés à des apports de phosphore élevés, elle est bien connue, je dirais, scientifiquement. À ma connaissance, en France, elle n'est pratiquement pas prise en compte dans les élevages, c'est-à-dire que il n'y a pas de préconisation de terrain. Il y a des préconisations de terrain sur le BACA, le DCAD, ou des préconisations de terrain sur les apports en calcium, en potassium. Mais sur le phosphore, les préconisations scientifiques sont, à ma connaissance, pratiquement ignorées sur le terrain. Oui, tout à fait. Donc on a souvent des rations qui, sur le papier, sont excédentaires en phosphore. C'est tout à fait vrai. Et donc c'est peut-être effectivement un point sur lequel, sur le terrain, les conseillers de terrain devraient se pencher un petit peu, en particulier dans des cas d'échec ou d'insuffisance de résultats sur des stratégies habituelles.
Ouais, non, mais enfin, je partage complètement et enfin pour traîner quand même un peu mes bottes de temps en temps en élevage, c'est vrai que c'est quelque chose qu'on aborde peu en France. Cet aspect excès de phosphore en préparation vélage, il n'y a pas de stratégie, à mon avis, qui existe sur le terrain aujourd'hui. Oui. À part qu'on écrit qu'il faut éviter les excès, c'est tout ce qu'on dit, quoi.
Just to be very specific, in our prepartum diets, we would never, well, I shouldn't say we would never, but we would very much restrict byproducts that are high in phosphorus. Canola, distillers' grains. So we would choose ingredients that are low in phosphorus. So typically a prepartum diet is designed to have less than 0.3% phosphorus content. And if we use acidogenic diets, and if we use the traditional equation, sodium, potassium minus chloride plus sulfur, we would typically target the DCAD, or what you call BACA, I think. We would target that at about minus 80 to minus 120 milliequivalents per kilogram of dietary matter. So we want the urine pH to be about 6.2, 6.5. Okay, some cows will be high, some cows will be low. That's normal biological variability. We do not want cows to have very low urine pH. Okay, because if you look at the titration curves of urine pH, you can have very consistent urine pH when it's very alkaline, like 8.2, 8.3. If I feed a traditional lactating cow diet, every cow would be 8.2, 8.4. If I feed excess of acidogenic salts, then you get cows that are very consistent, but they're going to be in 5.0, 5.2. That's very bad for cows. That suppresses insulin release, induces additional lipolysis, induces more insulin resistance in tissue. So you want your cows to be between 5.8 and 7. So you're going to get a mean of about 6.2, 6.4. And that requires monitoring. Good Farms in the US has always an employee that checks urine pHs twice a week.
So I started in the feed industry in the early 1990s, and in the U.S. it was very common back then to feed very high phosphorus levels in our dairy diets, both during lactation and even prepartum. And the negative DCAD diets did not work well. That was the strategy that was being used in the 90s. Was using negative DCAD diets. With these high phosphorus levels prepartum, we did not have very good success in those herds. If we had herds, I remember there were herds that were feeding up to 60 grams of phosphorus prepartum. That's a disaster. 50, it was common to see 45 to 50 grams. We don't need to be anywhere near that and have very successful transition cow programs. Next question.
Merci. Alors, cette question s'adresse à tous. D'un point de vue pratico-pratique en élevage, donc on est autour de la transition, d'accord. Quels sont vos avis sur des marées en préparation à 21 jours, des marées en début de tarissement à 60 jours, et l'autre côté après le vélage, d'aller jusqu'au pic, jusque garder la pleine dose pour les hautes productrices. Voilà, c'est une question pratique sur l'utilisation.
Ah bon, ben, oui. Bon, je pense que là, il y a beaucoup de stratégies possibles. Je pense que parmi celles que vous avez évoquées, il y en a une qui a évité, qui est de donner une ration de prépartum, une ration dite close-up pour les Américains, 2 mois avant le vélage. Là, ça fait quand même long. À l'ajout de choline. Alors, si c'est pour l'ajout de choline, je passe le micro à José. J'avais compris que c'était sur les stratégies préparatoires.
So I'll make a disclaimer here. I think all the research we do is very practical. We do research on a farm that has to pay the bills, and the experiments have to be applicable to the commercial farm. So I don't distinguish what we do on research from what we implement on farm. So I think what we do is very practical and applied. Now, if you're asking about choline in particular, if that's the question, I think to the best of our knowledge today, based on the typical dose that we use, which is about 13 grams of choline ion, so about 18 and a half grams of choline chloride in a rumen protect form, you should feed from 250 days of gestation to 3 weeks postpartum. That would be my recommendation. That's what we do on farms. Now, the 21 days postpartum is variable depending upon the space in the fresh pen, calving rate, and the policy of the farm. There are farms that if a cow is very healthy, they might move her to the high group in 2 weeks. So she would not stay 21 days. So there are nuances according to the farm. But most farms in the US move cows to the close-up pen once or twice a week. If it is once a week, it's plus or minus 3 days. So let's say Monday they move cows. So employees go there and get every cow that is 253 plus or minus 3 days, and they all get moved to the close-up pen.
But then only to the fresh group. No need to give extra choline to the high groups instance.
So again, we are feeding from approximately 3 weeks prepartum is theoretical. We base all our decisions on days of pregnancy. That's how we do. Every farm sets movements of cows before calving based on days of pregnancy. So that cow will be moved at 253 plus or minus 3 days to the group that gets supplemental choline. Now she calves. She goes to an early lactation pen, which is where they put a lot of effort identifying problems, disease, and taking action. That diet has rumen protect choline. So those cows might stay there 2 weeks if she is very healthy, might stay there 4 weeks if she's a cow that's not doing great. So on average, they stay there 21 days. Now, what happens after that? At the dose that we feed today, which is this 13 grams of choline ion, and with the few experiments that we have looked, there is no justification to feed post 21 days. It doesn't mean that the cows don't respond to that. The problem is that they do respond to choline past that, but you have to feed a very large dose, 35 to 40 grams of choline ion. And that becomes an economic decision.
So I've been with Balchem 10 and a half years now. I will tell you, when I first started with the company, we would have never dreamt of feeding Reassure earlier during the earlier prepartum. That 21-day pre-recommendation, we felt very comfortable with that. But there is some newer research showing epigenetic effects in these calves that are born to the Reassure supplemented dams. So we're doing some research currently looking at full dry period feeding of choline to see if that has enhanced benefits in the calves. So we're looking at full dry period feeding. I'm sure we will continue to look at feeding further into lactation as well as just to piggyback on what Dr. Santos said. Next question.
So in the same context of how long you should be feeding choline for, you just said about 21 days pre or maybe full dry. Our context in Europe, and especially in France, is that there is no post-calving groups. Would you still recommend to use choline pre-calving only? Is that worth it, or it has to be pre and post?
Okay, I'll answer that one. There certainly are benefits to feeding it prepartum only. There's only one published study looking at that. That was actually run a number of years ago when Dr. Santos was at University of California, Davis. And there were benefits. There were benefits to feeding prepartum only in that study, but that was an outlier study in the database at this point. It was the only study where it was only fed prepartum, and it was also only fed to nulliparous animals, and it's the only study that's been run that way. But there were benefits feeding it prepartum only, even in nulliparous animals in that study. We just completed a study with one of Dr. Santos's colleagues at the University of Florida, feeding full dry period and not feeding it postpartum, and that was also a factorial where there was during heat stress as well. So if during the prepartum phase, during the dry period, in the cows that did not receive additional cooling, evaporative cooling, they only had shade. Now, you have to realize heat stress is very severe during the summer months at the University of Florida. And those dry cows that were not cooled, they did not respond to Reassure supplementation, at least as far as milk yield. We're still gathering a lot of data from that study. There may have been other benefits that we haven't seen yet in the data. You need to cool your dry cows. That's very critical. And you mentioned that during your talk as well. The effects of heat stress on dry cows are huge. In that particular study, just the effects of the evaporative cooling on the dry cows, there was almost it's about a 6.5 kilo loss in milk yield if they were not cooled during the dry period, irrespective of whether or not they were supplemented with Reassure XC. In the dry cows that did receive evaporative cooling during the dry period, there was a 1.9 kilo energy corrected milk response in those cows. So, yeah, if they were fed choline, they did respond, and that was only a prepartum effect. There certainly are additional benefits to feeding it postpartum, and what I would say is, even if you don't have a fresh cow group, if you have some way to get some choline into these cows, even if it's only for a few days postpartum, it's going to be beneficial. If you have a way to top dress it, or some way to get it into those really fresh cows, it would be beneficial. Next question.
Maybe this is a question for everybody who is from here. Like when I started my, I guess, veterinary scientific career, if I think of the United States, for example, this was a long time ago. The typical dairy cow in the US would produce 9,000 kilograms of milk. That was the average of the 9 million dairy cows when I moved to the United States. Today, the average dairy cow in the United States produces 12,000 kilos. Out of the 9.2 million dairy cows, there's 12,000 kilos. With some farms with lots of cows averaging 17,000 kilos. And I like to think that the cow today is a lot healthier than when I started my career, to be 100% honest. So as I go to farms and I go to the best farms, these cows are producing 4,000 or 5,000 kilos more. That we have a steady increase of about 140 kilos a year continuously between the genetic increment and everything else that's done to those cows. I always have a difficult time grasping this concept that because these cows produce more, we're creating this monster. And I hear more of that discussion here. So what is the general overview or opinion in France? Because I go to farms today that average 55 kilos per day. I was in 4 farms about a month ago, and they averaged between 45 to 52 kilograms of energy correct milk per day for the last 12 months. One farm had 52,000 somatic cell count. They had 0.3% displaced double mason a year. They had, I think was the whole year incidence of mastitis with repeated cases was about, out of 1,000 cows, 220 cases, so 22%. And mortality in the first 60 days was 2.8%. So if I look at those numbers that I've seen in lots of farms today, they're much better than 30 years ago. And if I were to look at associations, I would say today we would reverse our concept. You know, in the past when I went to school, increased milk yield has reduced reproduction, increased milk yield has done that. Today I would probably conclude that increased milk yield has improved reproduction, increased milk. But I still have a difficult time wrapping my head around this concept of we are hurting cows because they became more productive. Granted that a lot of this production increases because we learn how to handle the cow and we completely destroy the old infrastructure and we create infrastructure that's compatible to the modern cow. And in the past we select cows and we put them in the very bad barn with the very bad management. Now we have designed beautiful barns. It's like 4-season hotel, the stalls where they lie down. We have a farm in Florida that beds the stalls 3 times a day. They rake and add new sand 3 times a day for those cows. They literally lie down in a 4-season, 5-star hotel. Those cows produce 110 pounds of energy correct milk every day. So I always have a difficulty to understand this concept that we've been bad to cows because they produce too much milk. And I just want to hear maybe overall comments from people here.
Je vais répondre en français parce que ça va être quand même plus facile. La production laitière française ou européenne est basée sur un historique de tradition, sur un historique de politique sociale également. Donc la vitesse avec laquelle l'élevage laitier français évolue est relativement freinée par ces traditions, alors que dans d'autres régions, que ce soit les États-Unis ou les pays émergents en production laitière, le raisonnement économique est à la base de tout. Aux États-Unis, si vous n'êtes pas productif, vous êtes mort et demain, vous n'existez plus. Ici, la politique sociale va maintenir un certain nombre d'élevages, malheureusement ou heureusement, je ne sais pas, mais ça a un impact sur le niveau de production. Mais ceci étant dit, vous allez trouver en France ou ailleurs en Europe des élevages excessivement performants et tout aussi performants que ceux que vous venez de citer. Si vous regardez la top liste européenne ou française, il y a des vaches à 15 000 avec des taux de 45, 33, sans aucun problème. Ce n'est pas la génétique ou le savoir-faire qui vont manquer, mais d'une façon plus moyenne, c'est le poids des traditions et la volonté de maintenir de petites structures en place pour le côté social.
Oui, ma question était justement combien de lactations font en moyenne les vaches chez vous avant d'être réformées?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So, in the United States, culling is, with a few exceptions, when you destroy cows, culling is always an economic decision. I don't know, I'll give an example. People would label, I eliminate this cow because of reproduction. I don't know one single producer who would sell a cow that's not pregnant and producing 40 kilos of milk. In general, producers eliminate cows because there is an animal that, if entered the herd, will be more profitable, or because they have an infectious disease or an accident or death. So in general, it's an economic decision. Going very specifically on your question, our average lactation today is 2.9. So the cow lives 66 months. The average cow in the entire 9.3 million cows, to the latest survey in the United States, is 66 months, 2.9 lactations. If you look at the age of first calving of our cows, on average is 24.5 months. Our calving interval today is 390 days, and it's going down every year about half a day. So when you do the math, our cows live about 2.9 lactations. Very few farms have less than 25% replacement a year. Our typical replacement would be 29 to 33% a year, of which 5 to 6% is because of death, and the remainder is it is more productive to replace the cow with a heifer for whatever reason. Low production because of extended lactation, low production because she had cases of mastitis earlier in lactation. Then it's a mixed bag of factors. But if you allow me, I want to just go back to the previous point. So I think you're 100% right. There are good farms all over the world, unquestionable. But I think we as technical people do a disservice to the industry how we interpret that information. And I think we need to think differently. If the issue of the modern cow that France, US, Canada, whatever country selected, she cannot perform, it's not because we developed broken genetics or the physiology is wrong. It's because we haven't designed the proper environment for that cow. And we need to be more open and tell people that the reason why we have all the issues that we have, which are real, morbidity is high, it's not a joke, it's because we don't do the right things to the type of cow that we design, yeah? But we use the easy way out, that we have this cow that is almost self-imploding, which that's not what biology is, yeah? And I think we need to transfer that message to producers, young technicians, like young veterinarians, young nutritionists, so they don't leave school with that mentality, because that doesn't seem right to me.
Oui, je pense qu'une des réponses supposées à la question était, vu les niveaux de production, une durée de vie plutôt plus faible des vaches aux États-Unis que chez nous, ce qui n'est pas le cas, effectivement. Et je pense que dans les raisons qui conduisent au fait que, entre guillemets, malgré des productions beaucoup plus élevées que la vache laitière moyenne en France, le taux de réforme ne soit pas plus élevé, tient un petit peu à la réponse que tu as faite, Laurent, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a des raisons sociales qui font qu'on maintienne des élevages dans lesquels la compétence de l'éleveur ou sa motivation n'est pas parfaite, et dans lesquels les conditions de vie et d'environnement que l'on offre aux vaches ne sont pas optimales. Et j'en citerai comme seul exemple la discordance forte qu'il y a entre ce que José vient de nous décrire sur l'allottement des vaches avec un lot de début de lactation, un lot de haute productrice, un lot de faible productrice, etc. Dans la majorité des élevages en France, vous avez un seul lot de vaches en lactation. Donc ils reçoivent toutes la même ration, sauf s'il y a effectivement une distribution individualisée, ce qui est de plus en plus souvent le cas avec les systèmes de robots. Mais la base de la ration est la même pour tout le monde. Et dans beaucoup d'élevages, il y a aussi un seul lot de vaches taries. Il n'y a pas un far-off et un close-up. Donc un seul lot de vaches taries. Et donc on offre des conditions, et pour ce qui me concerne, nutritionnelles, en tout cas pour ce qui concerne mes compétences et mes préoccupations, des conditions nutritionnelles qui ne sont pas parfaitement adaptées à chaque stade physiologique de vache. Et je pense que ça ne contribue pas à leur longévité.
Ouais, je pense qu'il y a aussi, je pense que ce lien entre une productivité qui pénaliserait la reproduction, la santé ou autre, je pense que ce lien, comme Dr Santos l'a dit, je pense qu'il faut qu'on l'oublie. Il y a aujourd'hui des études qui montrent que à l'échelle du troupeau, plus ta production augmente, plus tes performances de repos sont bonnes. À l'échelle du troupeau, parce que derrière, il y a un management qui est bon, il y a un éleveur qui est bon, il y a des encadrants, des conseillers qui sont bons, mais à l'échelle du troupeau, plus tu produis du lait, meilleur est ta repos. À l'échelle de la vache, au sein de ce même troupeau, c'est différent. Effectivement, on garde un effet de plus ta vache produit, plus tes performances de repos à l'échelle de la vache au sein d'un même troupeau, plus ça pénalise. Mais je crois il y avait une étude de Leblanc qui montrait que par 50 litres de lait produit, tu gagnais quelques pourcentages en taux de réussite, quoi. Donc, il y a pas cette opposition entre productivité et performance, repro, santé ou autre, quoi.
Well, thank you. I just heard last call. So it's been a great discussion today. I want to thank our audience for staying. And I'd like to ask each of our guests to maybe give one key take-home point from your presentation today. We'll start with you, Dr. Verdoolaege.
Non, enfin, ça rejoint peut-être ce que je viens de dire. Je pense que en tant que, pour la plupart, on est des conseillers en élevage, on essaye d'apporter du conseil aux éleveurs, et je pense que malgré tout, on joue un vrai rôle à ce niveau-là, et que les conseils et le management, la qualité du management qui peut être mise en place en élevage, on l'a vu à travers la maîtrise des éléments métaboliques, certes, mais aussi sur les aspects immunitaires, sur les aspects inflammatoires, etc. Et je pense qu'on a encore, au regard de ce qui peut être présenté comme résultat outre-Atlantique, une vraie marge de progrès dans nos élevages ici, de ce côté-ci de l'Atlantique. Ouais.
Oui, mais moi, si j'avais à donner un point clé par rapport au thème d'aujourd'hui des vaches en période de transition, c'est que ce sont des animaux très adaptables, mais qu'on peut atteindre des limites et qu'il y a tellement d'interrelations entre les troubles nutritionnels, les troubles sanitaires, les défenses immunitaires, etc., qu'il y a beaucoup de points d'entrée pour arriver dans des problèmes et que donc la maîtrise est difficile, effectivement, et qu'il est très facile de rentrer dans un cercle de problèmes et que c'est à nouveau ici la surveillance par l'éleveur ou par ses conseillers et la gestion des vaches au sens large, de l'alimentation, mais aussi le contrôle des stress, etc., qui vont être des points clés pour la réussite de cette période.
Well, I will address my topic in specific, which was supplemental room protect choline. So I would look at that as another nutrient that is important in terms of refining diets for transition dairy cows. So that would be my take-home message. There's, in terms of overall management of farms, there are many other things that are a whole lot more important than small changes that we apply to diets. But think of rumen protect choline or choline that needs to be fed as a rumen protected product as a nutrient that benefits cow performance and cow health. So that's how I would summarize my presentation.
Thank you. My take home would be, when it comes to rumen encapsulated products, would be to keep in mind this whole feed stability aspect. It's very overlooked. So I would ask for that data if it's out there, and it's really important to how these products will actually perform on the farm. So with that, I want to thank everyone for sharing your knowledge, your time, and for the great conversation today. And again, thank you to the audience that we had today. And to our loyal listeners, thank you for coming along for each episode and sharing with us as we explore more topics. We hope to see you each and every time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends. Thank you.